If you're a front-end engineer who is looking his ways into backend and for some reason he chose Java and Spring Boot and you have no clue what's going on, where to start, then this is video for you. And in this video you'll learn how to create a basic REST API with PostgreSQL integration using Spring Boot framework. And before we jump in, please turn off this video and go learn some Python. It doesn't worth it, just you will thank me later. And if you're still here, I'm sorry. Java and Spring Boot framework is not really the same as JavaScript, Python, Express, Flask or Django. You can't just create .py or .js file and spin up your API. I mean, you could, but it's not really the same. I'm no backend engineer by any means, so that's why learning Java for me and Spring Boot framework is a bit mind-blowing. So that's why I decided to create this video for front-end engineers like me to create their first Spring Boot application and provide a high-level overview of this framework in practice. So let's stop talking and let's go coding.
So Spring Initializer is gonna be the website that you're gonna visit the most, and you can think of it as a Angular CLI or Vite or Create React app. So basically any tool that helps you to set up your project. And in this case, Java people just a bit more smarter, and they came up with a website where you can set up your project, and you can see there are a lot of settings. And the first setting is the project, and here you have three options: Gradle Groovy, Gradle Kotlin, and Maven. So Groovy and Kotlin is JVM based languages, same as Java. In this case, I always go with the Gradle Groovy. I just didn't figure out the other two options, so select Gradle Groovy. Then language, as I mentioned, you have Java, Kotlin, and Groovy. Obviously, we're trying to learn some Java, that's why I choose Java. Here we have Spring Boot version, and snapshot is just like a temporary version, so I go with the latest one, and it's selected by default. Next we have project metadata, and it gave me nightmares for a couple of weeks. I couldn't figure out what should I put in a group, what should I put in artifact name, description. Okay, description is fine. Like, how does this thing work? And I found a pretty nice Reddit thread that explains all of this stuff. So for example, you have a domain, let's say mydomain.com. It's just a convention that when you build Java packages and Java projects, the domain goes first, like the extension com or IO, whatever, and your domain name goes afterwards. So this is going to be your project group name. And as an artifact, since we are building REST API, I'm just going to call it basic REST API. So this is basically the name of your project that you're going to work on. And then you have the package name, my domain basic REST API. And if you want to build another project under your company domain or under your personal domain, you're gonna put all of your projects under this domain group. And as a description, I leave it as it is. For packaging, you have jar and var. I set it to default. I just have no idea what's the difference so far. And as Java, I also leave it as a default. I don't want to play around with newer versions, so I just leave it to Java 17. And now the most important part, your dependencies. So in front-end projects, you have npm packages, right? You have package.json, and you use yarn or npm to set it up. Here you just have a list of packages that you can add to your Spring Boot applications. And the first package or dependency we're going to need is a Spring Web. From the package name, it's pretty obvious that we need it to build your web applications. Next, we have PostgreSQL driver, and one more package I use is Lombok. So yeah, Java annotation library, which helps to reduce boilerplate code. You will see in action when we start coding. And this is basically 3 packages that I use for most of my pet projects. For now, I don't bother to figure out in detail what those projects do, dependencies. So I just leave it as it is. Everything works fine on my side, and that's basically it. A few more features of the Spring initializer. You can see you can click explore, and here we have build.gradle. So you can think of it as a package.json. And here you can see all of your dependencies. So we added the Spring Boot starter web. So it's our Spring web. We have Lombok, we have a Postgres driver, and here one more annotation processor Lombok, and a few extra packages. Here you can see the plugins, the Java, the Spring framework itself, and the Spring dependency management. Also here you see the group that we entered, com.mydomain. Here you have a version set to default to 001 snapshot, and all of other settings that I have no idea what are those settings. And settings Gradle is just some default files, same for gradlew and gradlew.bat. Next we have src, and we have kind of different structure from what you used to have in your frontend applications. So under src we have test. I'm not gonna dive into it because I haven't written a single test yet. Next we have main, we have Java, and you can see how your project name like reuses all of your information. So basically you have com, you have my domain, and you have your project name. And here we have our entry point for the application. That's the default structure of your Spring Boot application. So you can click generate. It's going to download the project into your downloads. So you click save. That's basically it. Then you go unpack it and open your project. So once you open your project, to make sure that everything is set up correctly, try running the gradlew bootRun command. This is gonna basically boot your application. And if you don't see any errors and you see the Spring and some bunch of logs, then you have set up everything correctly. So this is our entry point for our Spring Boot application. I usually don't make any changes to it, and it stays the same. First thing we're gonna do is to adjust the application properties. So by default, you can see here spring.application.name, which is basic REST API. And here is the list of other properties that we're gonna need for our application. So the first one is spring.source URL. So basically you provide the URL to your local database. So for me, it's PostgreSQL. You have localhost port 5432, and the name is going to be basic REST API. Then you have username Postgres and password also Postgres. In your case, it can be different. And here we have also the setting for the Spring GPA Hibernate, and you have a few more options. So one of them is create and drop, and create and drop creates and then destroys the schema at the end of the session. Then you have just create, then you have none, then you have update, and then you have validate. For the purpose of this video, we're gonna use create and drop. I usually use some custom server port for each application, and it's gonna be, let's say, 3030, and that's basically it. We don't need any other properties in this file. And you may have questions, where did you take all this like properties? How do you know? I just Google them, tell you basically how to connect Postgres and how to change server ports. And now we can start to code. And I also forgot to add one more package that we're gonna need for our application. And if you're like me, you forgot to add a package and you don't want to recreate or regenerate your application with Spring Initializer, what you're gonna do, I usually just go to Spring Initializer, add the dependencies that I forgot to add, click explore, and just copy and paste the package that is missing. And in this case, I forgot to add the Spring Boot starter data.gpa, so we would be able to work with our database. And when I click, VS Code asks us if we want to synchronize our Java configuration. I click yes, and it automatically downloads the missing packages for our application. So the first thing we're gonna do is to create the tables in our database. In this case, we're gonna work on creating simple to-do application. So we're gonna create to-do table where we're gonna have a title and a description, and just save this information for our to-dos. And we're also gonna be able to delete them, adjust, and get a list of to-dos. And the first thing we need to do is to create the entity, the to-do entity itself. And I usually try to separate all of the project directories by their like common sense. In this case, it's going to be entities, and the first and the only entity we're going to create is to do Java. And to create a table, we need to import Jakarta.persistence to work with our database, and we're going to add the creator entity. So it's going to tell the database that, hello, we're going to have a to-do table in this database. And we also need to add the table annotation where we're gonna specify the name of our table that we want to create. In this case, it's gonna be to-dos. Now we need to specify the fields of table. And the first field is gonna be ID. That also comes from the Jakarta persistence. This is a decorator, but the field itself is gonna be private integer ID. The next field we're gonna have is title, and it's going to be private string title. Then we're going to have private string description. Okay, it's going to be string. Next is going to be private boolean is done. And we also need a field to, for example, filter by date. So it's going to be just private date created at, and we also need to import it from Java util. So those are the fields, but as you mentioned, we also need to provide decorators, because fields are not enough to tell our Spring Boot that this is going to be table properties. And in this case, we're going to use the column annotation where we're going to provide the name the same as the field. So column name title, then we have description, then we have is done, and then we have created at. And the next thing we need for the ID property is to tell Spring Boot that, okay, this is not just a regular field, but it's going to be a generated value. And we also have a settings or a strategy, which is gonna be set to generation type dot identity. Don't ask me why we need it. I just memorized it and I use it for every project. Next, to make the created at work properly, we need to specify one more annotation, which is creation timestamp. Without this annotation, the Hibernate or the tool that helps us to work with database won't be able to understand that this is also auto-generated field, and this should be just the creation timestamp, and it's not just the regular field. By default, for the is done, we need to have a false, otherwise it's going to be null. One more thing that we need to do is, this is just plain Java object or class, and we would need to use this class to create entities, to manipulate with them. To make it work, we need setters. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to use Lombok to reduce some boilerplate. So what I'm going to do is just going to import everything from the Lombok, and first annotation is going to be data. So this is going to create all of the getters for all of the fields. Then I'm going to need the no args constructor. This is required by the Hibernate. Then I'm going to create all args constructor. That's if we want to manually create the new to-do object, then we'll need to provide all of the arguments for this to-do entity. And one more annotation is going to be builder. So it would add the builder pattern to our to-do entity. In this case, we have some warning that builder will ignore the initializing expression entirely. So we need to add one more annotation, is builder.default. So if you're going to build the to-do entity using the builder pattern, then it won't require the is done field. And that's it for the entity. We're not gonna touch it anymore. Next thing we need to do for our application to manipulate with database is to create a repository, and it's pretty simple. So again, we could create the repositories directory. Here I create the to-do repository.java, and from this file we need to have a not class but interface, and this interface is gonna extend the CRUD repository, and we also need to provide the type of our entity, which is gonna be to-do, that we're gonna import from the basic REST API entities to-do, and the type of ID. So inside the controllers, I'm gonna create the to-do controller, the same naming pattern, and here we're gonna add the REST controller annotation. And to connect to the controller to the database, I'm gonna use the auto-wired annotation, and I'm gonna provide the private to-do repository, which is gonna be to-do repository, and we're gonna use this field to fetch our data from the database. And the first controller is gonna be API to-dos. Get mapping annotation is to tell our Spring Boot application that it's gonna be our endpoint, which we're gonna hit. Then we're gonna change the get to-dos, and the return type of the get to-do is gonna be iterable to-do. And I'm not gonna accept any params, and to return the to-dos, I'm gonna just provide the built-in method of the to-do repository, find all, and that should be all, and it's our first endpoint. And to test it, what we can do is to run gradlew bootRun. Let's see if everything works correctly. So as you can see, you might have some issues. And the reason I got this error is because I forgot to create a database. So to create a database, I'm gonna use the VS Code extension, and I'm gonna click plus. So we're gonna name it the basic REST API. So the same way we have it in the application properties. So this is the command you're gonna use to create a database. I'm gonna ahead and copy it and open the Postgres terminal. So you can paste this command into your terminal, and it will be the same command line. And so you just paste the create database, and you created your database. Now we can terminate the process, close this one, and don't save. So now when I'm gonna run the bootRun, everything should be okay. So let's see. Yep, we can see the database JDBC logs. So everything looks fine. And now if we go to the Postman, and I already paste the URL for our localhost, and the endpoint is going to be API to-dos. I'm going to click send, and I'm going to receive an empty array. So the next thing we need to do is to create our to-dos. So we're going to need to create one more endpoint. It's going to be create to-do. Instead of get mapping, we're going to use the post mapping. Obviously for a HTTP post request. So endpoint is going to be the same, and the return type is going to be, I think, just to do. The next thing we need to do is to be able to accept parameters or fields for our new to do, right? And we're going to use request body annotation, and we'll need to create the data transfer object, because we don't want a user to input the ID for our newly created to do. Same for is done, so by default it's going to be false. And we also don't want to accept created add, so that's why we need to create a separate data transfer object for to do that will accept only the title and the description of our new to do. So it's going to be create to do DTO, and it's going to be new to do. So we're gonna need to create it, and I'm gonna add it to the separate directory. So it's gonna be dtos, and it's gonna be create to do dto that Java, and it will create for us a class. So here I'm gonna use the data annotation from Lombok, same as we use here, because I would want to access objects, getters and setters. The next one is gonna be the builder, so we would have a more easier API to create the DTO, and it's gonna be also, I think, all args constructor. We don't need the no args constructor as we have for the to-do entity, because it's gonna be just a plain Java object. And here, what we're gonna do is to create the private string title and a private string description. And that's gonna be our data transfer object for creating a new to-do. Now we get back to the controller, and here we can import our create to-do. So now we can use it for creating our new to-do, and I think I'll rename the request body to the create to-do DTO, because I'm gonna use the new to-do naming in here. To create a new to-do, we're gonna use the to-do builder method, and we're gonna add the title. We're gonna use it from the create to-do get title, and we also need the description, and it's gonna be create to-do get description. So we get all of these methods and the builder method as well from the Lombok. So basically builder provides this builder method, and the data provides all of the getters and setters for fields. So here we just have for the create to do, we just use the data builder and all args constructor. So that's why we have the get title and get description. And if you wanted to have a create to do builder, we're gonna use the builder method. So, and then last building chain, we need to call the build method. So it would create our new to do. And from the to do repository, what we're gonna need is to call the save method on our new to do entity or our new to do object. And we're gonna click save. Now we go to the postman. Can copy that and change a method to post. Now we can go to body and click row and click JSON. So we need to provide the title, have title, and we're just gonna call it new to do. And the description is gonna be also description, just test description. So now we can click send, and we have the method not allowed. The reason for that is we need to reboot our Spring Boot application. Otherwise, changes won't be applied. So now when we click send, we have the ID, we have the title, we have the description that we sent, and we have the is done to set to false, because we provided here that it by default is going to be false. And the created add, so it comes from the creation timestamp annotation, and everything looks fine. So now if we try to call the get method for the API to do's, we get our new to do. Let's create a new one like to. So we get the both records of our newly created to do's. And the next endpoint we're gonna create is to do's ID, so to be able to retrieve to do's by their ID, and we're gonna rename it to get to do by ID, and it's gonna be returning the to do. So the next we're gonna path variable annotation. It's gonna be type integer, and it's gonna be ID. So basically this path variable, and Spring Boot will parse it from the URL from the request URL, and in the to-do repository, what we'll have to do is to call the find by ID, and we're going to provide ID. Here we see cannot convert from optional to do, and I don't really want, so okay, let's try to call the optional, and let's import it from the Java util. So the reason I don't really want to use the optional for the get to do by ID is this. Let's reboot it quickly. Okay, so as you remember, in the application properties we set the create and drop. So now if we try to retrieve the to-dos, we won't have any, we'll have an empty array, and so we need to create a new to-do, right? So we have ID1, let's retrieve it here. So now if I will try to retrieve this to-do by ID, so it's gonna be 1, I'll have it. If I don't have the existing to-do with ID 2, I'll retrieve null. And it might work for your case or for, I don't know, for your business logic, but I don't really like to return the null from the get response. I would rather send the response with the status code 404. And because of that, we need to use the or else throw method from the to-do repository find by ID. So it would allow us to use the just to do here, and that would be it. So now if we try to retrieve the non-existing to do from our database, let's see what it does. Okay, let's create a new to do, ID1. So the logic stays the same for the existing to do's. So now if we go, it's gonna throw the 500 error. So this is how we want it, but we need to change the exception handler for our get to do by ID. And to do so, first thing we need to adjust is to copy this no such element exception and say to our Spring Boot application that this method might throw the no such element exception. And the next thing is that Spring Boot has such a notation called exception handler, and in the parameters of this exception handler we need to provide the exemption class we want to kind of catch or override, and it's going to be like this, no such exception class, and it also should be a public method. So to do no such element exception, and it's gonna accept the exception of the type no such exception, and we're gonna return the exception get message. One more thing you also want to override is the response status of this exception. So instead of having status 500, we want to have the status 404. And to do so, we need to import the HTTP status from Spring Framework HTTP status and say it's gonna be not found. So now let's restart it and get back to Postman. Okay, create one more, retrieve number 1. Okay, behavior the same, and now we need to click send for non-existing to do. We're gonna see no value present, so the message can be changed depending on how you want to build your API, and we also changed the status to not found. So now I have a few more endpoints to create, and the first one is gonna be delete. So I'm gonna use the delete mapping. We're gonna use the same code as here, and we're gonna say again delete mapping. We're gonna say delete to do by ID. It's gonna also accept the path variable ID. And here I'm gonna return void, and we're gonna add that to the repository, delete by ID, and gonna provide ID here. So we're gonna need to remove this throws exception, and that should be it for the delete mapping. Now, if we go to the to-dos, we have empty to-dos, right? We're gonna create one, we're gonna create two. Now we have two to-dos. Let's delete with the ID 1. Gonna send, we have the status 200. And now if we try to retrieve a list of 8 to-dos, I'll have just only one. And the last endpoint, which is a little bit tricky in terms of implementation, is gonna be put. I'm gonna reuse, I guess, this one, the get API to-dos, and it's gonna be put mapping. Okay, let's do it the easier way. Path variable get mapping, and it's gonna be put. And let's use the put mapping. Okay, I had those, and we're gonna say update to do by ID. Okay, and here we're gonna accept the path variable as an ID, and we also gonna reuse the logic from the creation of our to do, and it's gonna be request body create to do, but instead create, I'm gonna call it update DTO, and here is gonna be update to do DTO. And the reason for that is I want to have a separate DTO for updating and creating our to-dos. So let's see why would we want to have it separately. Duplicate. I'm gonna duplicate the create to do file with a different name, with the update to do DTO, and also let's rename it. Let's rename the class. So the annotations are gonna be stay the same: data builder and all args constructor. But here, one more field I want to be able to update is the is done. Correct. But yeah, it should be boolean, not string. And also, when I want to call the put endpoint, I don't want to pass all of the fields, because for example, if for this to do I want to change only the title, or only the description, or only title and description, or only is done, I don't want to like duplicate my I don't want to send the whole to do object to update my to do. And we can use the optional util, Java util. So we're gonna wrap it so it's a generic type, and we're gonna wrap our field types with optional. So here we're gonna import it from the DTOs. So now, and yeah, we're gonna return the to do. So the next thing I want to do is to retrieve the existing to do, and we're gonna use the to do repository, find by ID. It's gonna be ID, and also what I'm gonna do is say or else throw. So the same way we handled this in our get to do by ID. Also, I'm gonna provide throw exception. Yeah, it's gonna be the same. So if I remove it, it's gonna be fine, but yeah, let's just leave it as it is. And I want to update my existing to do by utilizing the optional util. And the way I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna use the update to do DTO. Here I'm gonna say get title, and the methods, the optional methods that optional type provides is if present. So in case if this field get title present, I'm gonna say use existing to-dos method called set title. The reason we need the if present method is that get title can be null, and we don't want to set the null to our existing to-do. So what optional helper type does is kind of handles all of the null checks for us. And the same what we can do here, get description and get boolean. get is done. So here it's gonna complain on the type because we need to set the set is done, and here we're gonna use the set description. And finally, we need to call the to-do repository save, and it's gonna be existing to-do. And that's basically how I think it's kind of the simplest version how you can implement the put mapping. Now let's refresh it. Okay, let's create a new to-do with a test description. Let's retrieve this one. So here we can go and say we want to have a put, and it's going to be ID 1, and in the body I'm going to use the JSON, and let's say I want to change title to the updated title, right? And it's going to return the to-do with the ID 1 with updated title. And if you go to the API to-dos, it's going to also return with updated title. But now if I want to update the title to and call it is done to true, it's gonna also do that, obviously. And here it's gonna be updated as well as in the database. So we have our to-dos here. So this is my to-do with ID 1, is done true, the description, and updated title. And that's basically the basics of using Java Spring Boot for creating your first REST API. It's a bit more boilerplate comparing to, let's say, Node.js and Express, or maybe Python and Flask. If you're not so experienced in Java as I am, obviously, what I would recommend to do is to just write down all of the kind of black boxes that you have right now. For example, like what are those annotations, what are those repository, what are those exception handlers, and just Google them one by one, and just learn them one by one and kind of open for yourself a new black box and understand how this works. No need to go that much deep if you're just starting learning Java, and no need to go too much deep into details like how it works on the like machine level and stuff. So just understand how to write code and create, and just every week try to create some new functionality for your API. Just try, get some errors, fix them, and then you'll be able to succeed in finally, understand how the Java and Java for web development works.